Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We're going to talk about summits this week. We've got the Forestry Summit that occurred with the Premier and some federal cabinet ministers on softwood. We have the annual First Nations Leadership Council Summit in Vancouver, and we have the end of the summit of Premier David Eby's Task Force on Economic and Trade Security. Lots of summits to discuss, mounting summits. I'm not sure any of that works. This is the second time I've tried to make this joke, summits, and it has not worked either time. Nonetheless, we are going to continue with this and break it down with the panel. Jeff Ferrier, Allie Blades, Jillian Oliver, all here to help us with this. We're going to start, I think, with the First Nations Summit. There's two different ways into this. I want to just start with the context that we're in. And Jeff, we're going to go to you first on this, where the Cowichan Nation decision continues to sort of dominate Premier David Eby's agenda, the fallout of that, the appeal of that, the government's position on it. But we had First Nations leaders at the opening of this conference say they don't think the province should be appealing this. They're worried that it's fear-mongering, and they're not sort of pleased with the government's response. That tension, what did you make of that?
Well, leadership sometimes requires difficult conversations, and I think what you saw at the First Nations leadership gathering was a difficult conversation between the Premier and the Cowichan. Both sides, their positions are well known and well canvassed, and I think it took a good deal of leadership for the Premier to go in there and stick to his guns on, we need to appeal this, we need to protect private property rights. I will say that in terms of the entire summit, it was not so much overshadowed by Cowichan. It was a interesting gathering of First Nations from across the province, some speed dating going on between them and government, which goes to Vancouver for this whole summit, and lots of sharing of ideas about jobs, economic development, getting nurses into the community health centers, building fire halls. So it was, in that respect, real interesting.
It's a little bit like UBCM in a way, where there's a lot of those meetings that occur with the ministers. Yeah. Jillian, it's still sort of awkward, I think, to have First Nations leaders and the Premier kind of disagreeing, at least in a press conference anyways, about the future of what this is, the enormity of what this is. You have the Premier saying, people should have a right to be concerned. Their private property rights are uncertain as a result of this. And you have the nation saying, actually, no, we don't agree with that at all. That's a tension that doesn't seem to be going away.
Yeah, I think, the nations are in a tough spot because the judge handed down a ruling that went much farther than they were asking for. They were asking for a ruling on Crown and city-owned land, not on private property. And now they kind of all have to deal with the outcome with other things happening, including Bill 15, which was, I think, a big part of the conversation. That's the bill to expedite projects that could override the duty to consult with First Nations. That hasn't been applied yet on specific projects. They're consulting with First Nations on the regulation. So I think, just a lot of questions about how that's going to play out and the state of reconciliation overall. We also saw the Leadership Council come out and call for the resignation of One BC's leader, Dallas Brody, and are also, talking about how the Conservatives also want to repeal UNDRIP, which only passed unanimously in 2019, not that long ago. So a very rapidly changing landscape for their kind of conversations in the province and for the state of reconciliation. I think for a long time, it felt like there was sort of a positive trajectory, and now it feels like there's a risk of moving backwards. So it's I think, a challenging state of affairs for this conversation this year.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point too about the judge going further than the argument. And the Premier did say that. He said, my issue is not with the Cowichan's argument in court. It's with the ruling of the judge. And that's why we're appealing. And I thought that was a pretty effective way of him kind of framing that as part of the discussion. Allie, the other part of this that occurred, I know independent MLA Eleanor Sturko highlighted another title case that's occurring in the Kamloops area now. And kind of like a question that has begun to emerge about the enormity of the title discussion, the Aboriginal title discussion, and Cowichan being the kind of flashpoint for that, but a much larger reconciliation title issue occurring, and Jillian touched on it there, where it feels like in the polls are sort of indicating some hesitancy from the public to go further down the title path. So you have that context as well.
What we're seeing here is how each party and independents, for Eleanor's sake, going to define this issue in the lead up to the next election. This state of reconciliation, as Jillian very smartly put it, is likely going to be that election issue that I mentioned last week. Like, there is no avoiding this now. Now, what I think where Eleanor Sturko played a role in this week is that if the government was trying to hide anything or at least minimize the media coverage of certain things, the opposition's role now is to make sure that they bring it to the forefront, because it is one of those, not necessarily a wedge issue, but something that they can get the NDP on as a little bit of a win, because the NDP have been applauded for bringing up reconciliation in a positive way for so long. And that was a bit of a prize for them. And now not so much. And so when I say that this is going to be an election issue, now what we're seeing is not so much that the Cowichan issue is it's only limited to that, but rather a larger issue of how do we bring up reconciliation within each of the platforms. And to also my point of last week is, have we figured out what the strongest opposition to this is going to be? Not quite yet, because to what Jeff was saying, internally within the rooms, Jeff, you probably, to your point, this didn't come up very much, but on the media side, that's all from the outside looking in, that's all we saw was coverage about Cowichan and how this related to the relationship with certain stakeholders. And so it's going to be an issue that I think is going to continue to come up quite a bit, but differently for each party.
Oh boy. I mean, if we end up, Jeff, will go to you next on this, but if we end up in an election defined by reconciliation, I mean, there are so many good parts that we've all talked about in the past about the reconciliation movement, and but Allie's right. Like, it could become something else entirely when put through the frame of opposition lenses and election platforms and people trying to stake out positions. Do you think we're heading in that direction?
I think we're headed into a really ugly potential election situation where reconciliation is absolutely on the ballot. And it's not on the ballot in the way of who's best positioned to advance reconciliation. It's about First Nations and about whether or not reconciliation is worth doing at all. And you saw one party this week suggest that David Eby's not on the side of civilization, right? And that's the hole that we're going to be running down in this election, with some parties who are casting First Nations as people who are looking for special deals from their government friends and at the expense of the rest of us, when history and tells us that is absolutely false. But that's where we're headed.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't sound like a great election campaign, Jillian. I'm not looking forward to that. To that, I think. Well, it's possible. Although, if we do end up in an election in a couple of years from now, or whenever, we all who work in this industry are surprised at how issues can come out of nowhere and just dominate the agenda. So who knows? But if we head that way, what do you think that this matchup, this political posturing, is going to mean?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think it's really staggering to think of where we were just a few years ago with consensus on this issue and then the need to move forward with it in sort of like a rational, reasonable way, to now having such a wide array of positions among we got 5 parties now, I think, right? 5 parties, 6 parties if you get Centre BC. I think it is, and I can't help but be reminded of the conversations that are happening in the States, and I like with sort of immigrants being used as scapegoats for real economic problems. You see those tactics really being employed by 1BC. I think that it is a good incentive to not go to a snap election, because I think that the farther that the government can get along to getting some projects underway, we've already seen lots of those. I talked about last week some of the very visible major housing projects that our First Nations backed and partnered with in Vancouver. I think the more that we can sort of put the premier's words into action about how this is really about getting things done, how it's a positive thing for the economy, the less likely it is that those arguments from the far right are going to hit. But yeah, it's really wild these days. The landscape can change really fast on these issues.
Ophelia's telling me we got to go to a commercial break, so that's the time. We're going to come back and talk a bit about the forestry summit that occurred this week with federal cabinet ministers and Premier David Eby coming up right after this. All right, we're back. Let's talk about the other summit that occurred this week. Federal cabinet ministers, 4 or 5 of them, summoned to British Columbia by Premier David Eby for a softwood lumber summit. Forest Minister Ravi Parmar boldly proclaiming before the summit that this would be a pivot point in the future of forestry. I didn't see it, but it was an interesting event to occur right before the provincial budget. Allie, the forestry summit, the softwood summit, did it accomplish anything? What were your thoughts on it?
This was a communications exercise in its finest, right? It was David Eby, our premier, with his cabinet or key cabinet people, with the federal government and some heavy hitters joining us in Vancouver. And then to have that visual and then to be able to say these very smart lines, which I actually really enjoyed. This softwood is to BC as to the auto and steel sector is to Ontario. That was really good. Whoever wrote that, top marks for that. But equally, we can see it as very much a communications exercise, and we can kind of get it into the update on these bold ads that we're supposed to have in the United States as well. But when it comes to the opposition, there was also a very good line in that half of this crisis was made in the United States, but then the other half was made in Victoria. And so when it comes to opposition, this is the bread and butter of a lot of the constituencies that the Conservatives represent. On a personal note, one of the communities that this impacts was an announcement coming out of 100 Mile House with West Fraser shutting down, and that's about 160 jobs. I used to live in 100 Mile House. There's an appreciation for those small communities and just how much that means for the community. The mayor put out a statement saying that this is really going to impact much more than the 160 jobs. This is 500 jobs. And apologies for getting a little emotional, but essentially what the government is now saying is that they're going to try to advocate for jobs up north in an hour north in Williams Lake to the other West Fraser site. And so now 160 people are going to have to compete with the existing job market in Williams Lake. How is that really going to work? And so when we talk about the real action that needs to come into these small communities, this is not a joke. This is not a drill. There was a mill in the Chasm sawmill in Clinton, and we saw the devastation of when that shut down and the impact to small communities. And so do what you want with these communications exercise and who's going to look better on TV. But in the meantime, we have real families that are going to be impacted by this in a very significant way. And it's devastating. And I just don't think that we realize this when we're just chilling in Vancouver.
Jeff, there is that 50-50 argument, I think, because you do see with the West Fraser closure, some of it to do with tariffs and from the United States, but also to do with a lack of access to fiber in British Columbia, which are provincial government policies. So I think Allie's got a good point there. The summit talks about one half of it, but the other half could be provincial action that the NDP sort of remains kind of at risk of being criticized for.
Yeah, I know we're talking a lot about task force, but there's also task force into looking at that fiber issue and seeing if we can get more fiber to mills in British Columbia to keep people working. And the people that Allie talks about in 100 Mile House and other forest communities are exactly why this is such an important issue. I think it's notable that the government was able to get such senior cabinet ministers here and in front of cameras to talk about these really difficult issues that they'd rather not talk about and make BC problems the day before a significant federal budget. I think that the threat of ads into the United States probably played a lot into why the folks from Ottawa showed up and took part. And I think really now the issue is in the hands of the federal government in a certain respect. We've got 22 members of parliament, Liberals, elected in the last election. We'll see if they can come through for British Columbia, like the members of parliament in Ontario and Quebec have for folks in the manufacturing auto sectors out there.
Jillian, even if they do come through, Ottawa's role is kind of like providing emergency aid, like a life raft as the ship sinks. And BC's role seems to be like charting the course of future of forestry. And the two kind of get conflated in events like this. If you were listening to the premier, it'd be like, Ottawa is going to fix forestry. I don't think Ottawa can fix forestry. They can provide aid, but I don't think they can fix it. But what do you think?
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt. Ottawa has much stronger taxation powers, and they did come through with some support in the budget, money for product development and diversification and retraining workers. You do see this isn't the first round of tariffs on softwood that we faced. In fact, Biden actually doubled them. The U.S. picks on softwood in particular because they think that Canadian lumber industry is unfairly advantaged because it's all on public land. And I think, actually the more government support that goes into it, the more the Americans see it as over unfairly competitive industry coming into their market. So the mills that are doing well are the ones that have responded to previous rounds of tariffs going back to 2017 by diversifying to other markets like Europe and Japan. So I think that those are areas where the federal government can also lend a helping hand because they're responsible for trade and also with that product development diversification because that helps just give more specialization and makes these mills more resilient. I think, the forestry industry has been in peril for a long time, certainly most of my life. And even when the cut was up, jobs were still declining because they're also up against automation and other things like that. So I think, we have to find opportunity in the crisis and innovate and look for other areas to sell this wood, because I don't think even if we got a change in administration in the US that this issue would be going away.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take a quick break there, come back, talk about the Premier's economic Trump tariff task force. What's happened with that right after the break. Welcome back. Premier David Eby's much vaunted task force on trade and economic security. Remember, we talked about it at the start of this year to fight Donald Trump, get labor, business, First Nations all together on a task force. Turns out, actually, that thing quietly wrapped up a couple months ago and no one even knew. I guess, Jeff, let's start with you on this one. I guess we're, evolving in our response to Donald Trump, but how come in your mind, how come our task force didn't work, I guess, in bringing all these people together? Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Rob, you're so negative. You got to stop watching those next Netflix crime documentaries, which are downers. Prime has just uploaded Three's Company, the entire series. You can watch that. John Ritter's physical comedy is amazing. If it doesn't make you laugh, bring a smile to your face, I don't know what will. I think the issue with this task
it's a weird
force
segue, but I'm going to give you as the judges say, going to give you the space to develop it. Yes.
It's not who's on a task force. It's what's the government doing that's important. The government is moving forward with an agenda of moving forward these major projects in an expedited way, diversifying our economy. And if they want to get in touch with anyone in that task force, everyone's on speed dial. They can consult that way. And I think that's the way forward.
But why did we do it in the first place, Jillian? Like, it was like the thing. It was changing BC's economy, getting it moving in a new, this is just gangbuster. We had the Prime Minister come out and speak to this task force in February, and now we don't even need it, apparently. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it was reactionary. I mean, if you look back even at public opinion polling and how it's changed, tariffs and Trump were the top issue back then, and now it's slid down the list where people are more focused on like more specific issues like affordability in the economy. So I think it was probably a bit of political theater to show that they were treating it like the emergency that everyone was perceiving it to be at the time. The problem was that it was way too broad. I think we have a very diverse economy, big province. It just makes more sense to deal with the industries individually. Successful task forces, they can be successful sometimes, but they have to have very specific outcomes and mandates. Otherwise, you just go down a rabbit hole. Lots of interesting, smart people can go down rabbit holes if they don't have clear parameters of what they're trying to accomplish. I've been in lots of those meetings. They're fun sometimes, but often things don't get done.
Yeah, no, good point. Allie, wrap us up on this 1 minute. What do you think of that?
Well, I think with one, he had a lot of heavy hitters on this task force too, right? That also have mandates of their own to their members, to their organizations. And so I think there might have been a bit of a crossroads of where would they be best served to benefit the province. But then to Jillian's point, unless they had like a mandate of let's diversify our markets and then go on a trade mission or join David Eby on his trade mission, then it could have worked. But unless you have those, then, here we are. No report from what I understand, nothing to really show of it other than it existed.
Yeah, it existed. It was a moment in time. I think Jillian's got a good point about, that was what was made to look like the province was doing something at a time when people wanted it to do something, bring our brightest, biggest brains in the room. But from what I understand, when you put 20 big brains in a room, you don't even get past the introductions. So it's kind of unwieldy thing for governments to have to do. Okay, great. Thank you to the panel for breaking everything down this week. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our audio podcast for extra discussion. And we'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.